AMD finally has a high-end CPU and high-end GPU. Today, we're going to be doing a build guide in the Silverstone SG14 Mini ITX case. You're going to be shocked at the amount of performance we can fit in such a small enclosure. Let's get started. Hey guys, Tiago here. So today we're going to be doing a build guide with all AMD parts. Now it's been a long time coming, but finally AMD does have their high-end CPUs and you can pair it for the first time with a really high-end GPU. Of course, you could do this previously with like a 5700 XT, but now, especially with the 6800, we're getting performance that's really rivaling NVIDIA for the first time on the high-end market. And before we get into the build guide, a few notes on stock and availability. If you guys watch me a lot on the channel, you know that this is certainly a primary concern. Now, first, the 6800 is a very difficult GPU to get and will likely remain difficult stock, probably well into sometime next year. So you can replace whatever GPU that you want to put in here. This case actually fits up to a 3-slot GPU. So you could even put in an older 1080 Ti, like a triple slot card will fit. And of course, if you can find one of the new RTX 3000 series GPU, even though it's not AMD, they're going to fit and work just fine. In fact, stock and availability has been a little bit better for things like the 3060 Ti and 3070. And of course, the RTX 3080 will likely be the ideal price to performance if you can find it in stock and put it into the system. As far as the CPU, once again, if you have a Ryzen 3000 to chuck in there, that's going to help as well. And of course, if you can get one of the Ryzen 5000 CPUs, and they have been coming in stock more, especially the 5600X and the 5800, that's why I chose the 5800X for this build. Not only is it 8-core, 16-thread, very high performance, but it's also a little bit easier to find than the 59 and 5950X. In fact, places like Micro Center and Newegg have restocked recently the 5600X and the 5800X, so certainly it can be possible to find these. Let's talk about the actual build. So the first thing, we're going to talk about the case. This is the Silverstone SG14 Mini ITX case. Now, this is a Mini ITX case, and you can fit the ITX such as the X570 Impact. That's the motherboard we have in here right now, and we're going to talk about this later on as well. But the Silverstone SG14 Mini ITX, that actually has a tremendous amount of room. You can fit up to a 240 millimeter radiator on the side. I decided to go with a Noctua air cooler. I just wanted to do a really overkill air cooler and see how it would fit and come out. And it actually fit. It's definitely a little bit of a tight fit, especially with that back panel. It certainly was able to fit. And of course, a nice big air cooler like this is going to give you better performance than a much smaller cooler, especially on something as powerful as the 5800X. Now, you'll see in this case where the power supply goes. Technically, the space is there for an ATX power supply, which is going to be larger, but I decided to actually put in a small SFF power supply. This one is from Silverstone, a 650 watt power supply, just because I figured 650 watt will be enough for this build, just because it's going to give me a little bit easier of a time managing the cables. ATX power supply fits well, and of course, you don't get a bracket for a small form factor power supply, but for now, I have it just connected sort of on two ends. I screwed it in. It's very secure, and it gives me a lot more room down below it in order to cable manage and just have a little bit better airflow. Great thing about this case, all of the panels are actually removable, so it's very easy to work in. You can take out all of the panels. They have these captive thumb screws, so it's really easy to actually build in because you can take off all the panels, and that way you have access to areas that may be usually difficult in a small enclosure. You can get it at a bunch of different angles, and of course the build quality I really like on this case. Now, it's not going to be the cheapest case on the market. Stone sent me this SG14 case to do a review as well as do a build in, and it's really refreshing to do a build that's powerful in a small case. So certainly I've had a lot of fun. Come in around 19 liters in size, and of course you can get much smaller Mini ITX cases down all the way to 10 liters and below. But I actually kind of like having this size because then you can fit more hardware in it, much bigger GPUs without being as limited. And of course, you're going to be able to fit more cooling solutions. I think you could even have room to do a nice little water-cooled setup. In the future, I may do something like one of EK's FLT reservoirs, like maybe 120 millimeter reservoir. You can fit a D5 pump, reservoir, a radiator in there, and a water block, and I think that would look pretty cool as well. But you do have a lot of options options. You could fit a 240 millimeter AIO radiator there, or you can fit an air cooler. And I think we can agree this Noctua air cooler is going to be pretty much one of the biggest that you can actually get. So for it to be able to fit within this case, definitely pretty impressive. Talk a little bit about the case's airflow. Now, it does come with these removable magnetic dust filters, generate a little bit more airflow. And of course, in this case, they're pretty easy to remove. And I think you have pretty nice airflow where the GPU is. Now, you do have the little holes for air to be able to pass through. They're not massive, but they seem to do the job. And of course, even with this large air cooler from Noctua, you still have a couple of places that you're going to be able to put fans. Like on top, you can fit a thinner profile fan if you want to have an exhaust. Now, keep in mind, if you do use this Noctua cooler, I had to take the bracket for the 240 millimeter radiator out of the back. You don't need that at all, but then you don't have a bracket to put a fan where the power supply is. So that's the only thing to keep in mind. Now, if you do a smaller air cooler than this Noctua one, you may have a little more clearance in the back. As it is, the Noctua one goes pretty much right up to the panel, so it's a very tight fit, but a smaller cooler will allow you to put more fans around the case. But overall, you do get decent airflow if you do the fans correctly, and definitely it's not completely enclosed. You have enough places for the air to be able to come in as well as go out. So let's talk about some of the other components in this build. First is going to be, like I mentioned before, the CPU and motherboard. Here we're using the 5800X. It's going to be AMD's Ryzen 5000 Zen 3, amazing performance for gaming. And now I chose the 5800X because along with the 5600X, it's a little bit easier to find when they do restock. And I know it's limited availability, but they have certainly been restocking recently. In fact, when I went to Micro Center and got this 5800X, they had over 25 in stock, but I've seen it on Newegg and different places for those people that do not have a Micro Center near them. And then for the motherboard, I would probably recommend you guys go with a little bit cheaper ITX board. Here I'm using the X570 Impact just because it's the motherboard that I had on hand and I wanted to try out some of its really more robust features for overclocking. But in general, you'll be fine with something like the Asus ROG Strix, the I. That's going to come in around $250 compared to over $400 for this X570. And I think you're certainly going to get your money's worth with the cheaper motherboard, and performance should be pretty close. Now with this Impact motherboard, if you do choose to go with it, you'll see it has a little PCIe card where you'll put your 2 NVMe drives. And with this case, I had no problems with space or clearance. So you certainly have enough room for that. Of course, with the GPU below it, even with a big air cooler. And then, of course, a few tips to remember. Try to update your BIOS if you can, if it's a motherboard you have already. Because, for example, this X570 motherboard I bought brand new from Micro Center, and it did not come with an updated BIOS where the Ryzen 5800X would work out of the box. But thankfully, it does have BIOS flashback, which you can update the BIOS without having the CPU installed. So that was definitely a lifesaver, a game changer. I would recommend whatever Mini ITX motherboard you guys get, or even a larger, Ryzen motherboard, remember to try to get something with BIOS flashback, because even if a motherboard is brand new, it may not have the newest BIOS to work out of the box. And then in terms of BIOS settings that I change, usually I'll just go in there and enable the memory profile, usually the first profile, so that way you're getting sort of what your memory is marked for and not the base speeds. That's usually pretty easy to do. You don't have to touch too much else. Maybe the fan curve I'll adjust depending on how the thermals are, just to make it a little bit more pleasant and so the fans don't ramp up tremendously. Now just keep in mind that if you're going to be building in this with that Noctua cooler, you do have to look at the compatibility for RAM. You can't have too tall sticks of RAM, because or else that particular cooler is not going to fit. Here I'm using the Corsair Vengeance LPX. It's very low profile RAM, and this you can find in various speeds. Probably would recommend 32 or 3600 if you can find it. Now it is low profile RAM, so it's great for a case like this. Even if you're using a 240 millimeter AIO to cool your CPU, you may have a couple of clearance issues, so just make sure that the RAM that you're using isn't really tall, just because anytime you're using a Mini ITX case, it's certainly one of the things you have to keep in mind, especially with an air cooler. Just make sure that your RAM is compatible. And I mentioned that this motherboard actually has space for 2 NVMe drives, and that's what we're using here. I'm using the WD Black, the 750N 512 gigabyte. Very fast NVMe drive, and the price, often you can get it for a really good price, or especially around Black Friday. performs really well. They also have the new Pro 980. That's going to be a bit more expensive, but you will be getting PCIe Generation 4 speeds. And of course, this being an X570 motherboard will take advantage of those speeds as well. So it's just something to keep in mind. And now onto the GPU, I do have the AMD RX 6800 in here. Now, of course, this is going to be a difficult GPU to find, so you can sort of, replace whatever you want. You're just not going to be able to do like smart access memory at this time if you do NVIDIA GPU with the Ryzen 5000, but that's okay. If you have an RTX 3080 or even a last generation, a 2080 Ti, you can certainly just fit in whatever GPU you can. I know availability is a big issue, but just keep an eye out on my other videos as well. We have been talking about availability and stock and when things are coming in. It's not impossible, but it certainly is difficult to get a GPU. So now the GPU fit really great, actually made for a very pleasant user experience on my desk. Of course, when all the panels are shut, you're going to have a little bit more heat in there, especially with the air cooler. But as long as you work out your exhaust fan and your intake fan, I think you should have some decent thermals, especially considering what the size is. So overall, certainly very exciting to be able to build a high-end AMD case, having both the CPU and GPU. Of course, this is more theoretical now for a lot of people that can't get either of these right now, but when you eventually can, you can kind of see at what great performance you can pack in such a small enclosure. I mean, if you think about even the 6800, like it's beating the 3070, which is equal to a 2080 Ti. So you're getting the GPU here that's way more powerful than a 2080 Ti for around $579 MSRP when it was released. So when these start to come more into the market and more people can get them, certainly will have very great gaming performance. All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed this build guide. Let me know if you have any questions down below. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.